Hi, I'm Carl Stabe of Domino Connection, and today I have Mike Pacchione with me, and he's with Duarte. He's a master storyteller, and I'm so glad he's here because he's going to talk a little bit about storytelling and connection and how they fit together. Thanks, Mike. Thanks for being here.
Hey, Carl. The pleasure is all on my side of the Skype screen.
Well, thanks. Now, I'm curious, how did you get started in storytelling? And then we'll start there and how you got into Duarte.
Yeah, yeah. In a word or in a phrase, I guess the short answer is grace of God. Basically, I was someone who I didn't feel like I fit into the corporate world, and I don't want to be too dramatic with that. It's not like people were pointing at me and laughing like he doesn't fit in, but my instincts felt a little different than other people. I would be at meetings and I would be more bored than other people were. Other people seemed to accept that. And I mean, seriously, like I used to do a sales job, and one of the things written on my review was he seems really bored at meetings. And I don't know, for a while I just felt like that was how things were, and that was just something that was difficult for me to accept. But we would occasionally do trainings in my department in sales, and I loved them. I love standing up there. Here, Carl, I'll go back a little bit because I don't remember exactly where I was.
Okay.
I'll just say. So I was someone who I just didn't feel like my instincts fit into the corporate world. And, I don't want to be too dramatic about that. It's not, it's not like people were pointing at me and laughing or anything, but I just found myself really bored in things like meetings and presentations. And where I flourished was on the other end of it. I loved putting meetings together. I loved putting presentations together. So I did the corporate world for a while, did a sales job, loved it, did really well, but it just like the meetings, were dreadful. And it was even written on my review at one point, like Mike clearly is bored in meetings. So my next thing was I felt like, okay, well, I'm going to go back to school, because school's going to solve everything. So I'm going to go back to school and I'm going to be a college professor. And then that quickly was not the answer either. I didn't realize that graduate school was so much about grading and research, and I didn't get to do the stuff that the teaching part was like 20% of the job. So then I'm in a real quandary. And next step is like, okay, well, now I just need money. Like I finished grad school, I have this debt to pay off. And so I got another corporate job, kept teaching on the side. And then this is where I just got extremely, extremely lucky. And this will inform my Duarte story as well. So I was teaching a college class, and it's on careers, right? So it's like looking for jobs. This guy comes up to me during a break and he says, "Hey, Mike, I feel like you're a really engaging presenter. I actually work at Nike. We'd love to bring you in to present sometime." So like, okay, seems like something I should do. So like, yeah. And then of course I try to put on this facade, like I get asked to do this all the time, right? And start asking, well, how much would you pay, and when would it be, and blah blah blah, and I don't know what I'm talking about. So he's like, okay, well, I'll put you in touch with my boss who runs our whole department, and you guys can sort it out. So I'm on the phone with this boss, and I'm just trying to sound remotely like this has happened before, and he's very like, okay, well, what would your topic be? And I said, well, I have a few different topics I could talk about, but, I can do this or this or da da da. And Jeff was the guy who had come to my class, and Jeff says, well, why don't you talk about the lesson you were giving when I was in your class, which was I had been talking about using Twitter and LinkedIn for jobs. And I just felt like that was hopelessly boring. Like, why? Like, I have one chance to present at Nike. I'm not talking about Twitter and LinkedIn and using them for jobs. So this is how arbitrary me entering into this world was. I then worried myself to death for about 2 weeks, just desperately trying to find something that I would be excited to speak about. But the problem here is that I haven't actually done any great bit of research. I'm not, in that way, I'm not an expert in the field. I'm just someone who's instinctively good at this stuff. And so I called one of my buddies from college, my buddy John from college, and I just said, hey, John, I got this thing at Nike, and I I don't know. Have you ever reached that point where you're like so paralyzed by indecision that you don't you just want someone to decide for you. Like it wouldn't matter what it was. It's just like
Mm-hmm.
someone else make the decision. I mean, that was totally me. So I was on the phone with my buddy. Oh, I got to do this thing at Nike. And he said, well, why don't you talk about the Tower of Story? And I didn't know what he was talking about, but he said it with such conviction that it felt like the Tower of Story must be a thing. And I'm picturing like college textbook where it's like figure 3-1, like in the corner, like the Tower of Story. Like I must have just forgotten what it is. And so he Tower of Story. I'm like, okay, done. I'll do that. Get on the phone with Nike. Hey, I want to talk about the Tower of Story. And I say it with all this conviction because my buddy John had all this conviction about the Tower of Story. So I get on the phone with Nike people. Oh, I've got my topic, and I'm all powerful this time. I got my topic. I'd like to talk to you about the Tower of Story. Like I say it like that, the Tower of Story. And then, thank God this was not a face-to-face meeting. The people on the other end, they're like, oh, the power of story. I'm like, oh my God, power, not tower. The power of story. We love the power of story. And they're like really pronouncing the P. I mean, the power, and this is all I'm hearing. I'm like, oh my God. And then get off the phone. I sit down. I'm like, you moron. It's the power of story, not tower. Like that. But on the plus side, that I can actually talk about. So I get ready, put my presentation together, da da da. And I'm feeling pretty good about it. Sit down with my buddy. I have a buddy who runs like a storytelling company for animation up here in Portland, and sit down with him, and he's like, well, this is good, but there's a woman who just gave a TED talk on like this exact same subject, and she gives like the entire, like, here's what the shape of a presentation should be. And, you should just go watch that. So I'm like, oh, I'm not, I don't want to do that, and da 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 da. But curiosity gets the best of me, and I check it out. And it's Nancy Duarte, who years later I worked for. But I watched this TED talk, and I mean, this is like way better than anything I'm going to give. So then I'm in a little bit of a quandary. Like, so should I just steal what she says, or what should I do here? But what I decided to do was just give the presentation that I was going to give, which was nowhere near as good as Nancy's. And so it was good. It was like a B plus, maybe an A minus, but it's not like the life-changing presentation that you yearn for.
Mm-hmm.
I get home, I'm like, okay, let me check out this Nancy Duarte woman, and then I find out that Duarte does story better than anybody, and they were the ones who helped Al Gore out with An Inconvenient Truth, and I like look at their website, they've got all this cinematic stuff. It's like, oh my gosh, this is great. Start following Nancy on Twitter. One day she takes a screenshot of an email from a client, has her email address there, and I'm like, oh, well, I'm going to get in touch with this person. So, maybe a month goes by, I get a good grasp of her personality. And I remember, I'm like, okay, so I'm going to email her. And I spent like 45 minutes crafting the perfect email. So it's like clever, but not obnoxious. And it's funny, but again, not obnoxious. And it states that I'm good at this stuff, but it's like very much in deference to them. So I'm saying like, I know I'm good at this, but y'all seem like the best. And so I remember I was about to press send on the email. And like, first of all, it seemed like you should have to do more than just click this little button. Like, you know what I mean? Like there should be a bigger barrier than that. But I was about to press send on this email and had this thought go through my head, which was that I should send it in the morning instead of at night. So I set my alarm for early the next morning, wake up, like triple check the email. And I'm like checking to make sure I say, instead of the, like little word choices that nobody would notice. And anyway, so I press send and I'm like, okay, well, we'll see what happens with that. And like, dude, this is how out of touch I was with it. So then I went into work and I checked my Gmail, and Gmail would say like me, comma Carl, like for the conversation. So this is me, comma Nancy. I'm like, who is Nancy? And I read it, and I'm like, oh my God, she wrote back to me. and then of course I had to actually make contact and make things work. So that was a really long answer to your question, but that's how Duarte started for me.
That's a great story, right? I mean, it puts you in place of... So when you get in there and you start learning all these concepts, I guess, what is some of the things that you didn't realize, like, that would help people connect through story that you're using more and more of?
Yeah, totally. So I think the biggest thing that jumps to mind when you say that and Nancy would say, well, Nancy has said, Nancy does say, the audience is the hero, so the audience is the Luke Skywalker character, which even when I'm saying it out loud to you or anybody who's listening, that makes sense, right? I mean, it makes sense. But the problem is that's not how people treat presentations, not how people treat conversations. You're so worried about yourself all the time. It's just like, oh my gosh, what do they think of me? How should I say that? Was that a cool enough example? What's their opinion right now? When the fact of the matter is, like, all you ever need to do is to be talking to the person who's across the Skype screen or across the table from you or whomever. Like, all you ever need to be doing is putting things in terms that they understand and they like, and really that resonates with them. I mean, that's your whole job. And I think prior to meeting Nancy and encountering her stuff, if someone had said that to me, it would have made sense, but it is not the way that I was approaching communication.
So did you start then crafting stories around your life that they could resonate with, or stories around what you thought that they wanted to hear?
Okay, say that again.
Did you craft stories around yourself, or did you craft stories around what you thought they wanted to hear?
Okay, so it's actually like the mix of those two things. So I wouldn't say it's what they wanted to hear as much as what they need to hear put in words that will make sense to them.
Okay.
Part of that process is figuring out where there's some connection between myself and them. So here's a really, really basic example. That story that I just told you about my whole career, I still teach this careers class, the one that the guy, Jeff, had originally visited. I still teach that careers class. I tell that story every single time. And the reason why is because most people who take that class are junior or senior in college and they're communications majors, which means that they don't know what the heck to do with themselves. And my story is very much one of a person who didn't know what he wanted to do with himself. And so what I'm doing there is I'm telling them a story that they need to hear, which is that you don't necessarily need to have it figured out. It's got a lesson in it that will resonate with them, which is that, like, basically just try stuff. You never know what will happen. And it's from me. So there's like that intersection of myself and of them.
I see. And then they can envision themselves like struggling, but also find Luke Skywalker breaking through to find that perfect job.
Yeah. And I mean, you know, there are a few stories that almost anybody will resonate with. So even if you don't know the person you're talking to, stories about being a child and like dumb stuff you did as a kid, or things you used to do to trick your parents. Like, almost everybody loves those stories. So in almost any circumstance, you can tell that story and win. Like, there's one story that I tell about, 'cause I'm weird. I hated eating growing up. So I tell this story, and it's like this funny story about how I hid chicken nuggets in my pocket, and then later at night, I was wrestling with my brother. So the only way my parents could get me to eat was to bribe me with ice cream. That was the only thing in the world that I enjoyed. So I would sit there at the dinner table, and I wouldn't eat anything, and I would just like wait till they looked away. And in this particular case, I hid chicken nuggets in my pocket. So I put them in my back pocket, which is like dumb. And I don't know why I never thought to just go to the bathroom and flush it down, but I didn't. And so I hid chicken nuggets in my back pocket, and there was like this big grease stain on my back pocket. My dad sees me wrestling with my brother, and he's like, "Michael, what is that?" He reaches in, grabs these chicken nuggets out of my back pocket, and then that was like the first time I got grounded, right? Well, I tell that story, and not everybody can relate to like, a lot of people like eating. I would say most people like eating. But a lot of people can relate to either food being nasty or really loving ice cream, or, and here's the big one, trying to sneak something by your parents. So that story I can tell in most audiences, right? So there are a few stories. This is a long way of saying there are a few like themes of people that will resonate with almost anybody.
And so it's those psychological trigger points in those stories that you need to be able to use to build that connection. So when you need to deliver information, they're able to listen.
Yeah, totally.
Okay. So,
Yeah.
because I just read, like, I forget who said it, but basically, if you can make someone laugh, the next thing that you say is more likely going to stick in their mind than anything else.
Yeah, I don't know who said that either. That's freaking genius.
Yeah.
Here's like what jumps in mind when you say that. So the number one most watched TED Talk is Sir Ken Robinson. It has more than 25 million views. And have you watched that one?
Yeah, the education guy, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
totally. And it's amazing, and it is so funny. And he tells a few stories at the beginning that are amazing. Like just everybody laughs at them. And that's there's a clip in there that we showed Duarte, or we showed during our Duarte workshops, and people crack up. Well, here's like the deeper art of what he's doing. He tells those stories to make people laugh, and then at the end of the stories, he attaches the point of each one. And then if you watch that whole talk, as it goes on, it gets less and less funny. But because the audience has laughed and he's taught them lessons at the beginning, they're more hooked on what he's saying.
Mm-hmm. And it's got to be some sort of ingrained when you're in a tribe and the leader's talking to you, that emotional connection that he has, and then you're following him just like anybody on stage or talking to a group of people. Yeah.
Yeah, I would think so. Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know this, like, you know, the whatever the
Actual
big word
studies.
is.
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. So it's interesting. So I guess as a company, how, it's nice to have personal stories as a kid, but how do you tell stories as a company to get people to buy into what you're doing?
Yeah, that's a really big one. So that's one of the most important things you can do, because basically if you're not okay, so companies need to keep adjusting to society, right? In the same way that like Madonna has continued to reinvent herself, companies to a certain extent need to do the same. Now, it doesn't have to be as radical as what Madonna's done, but if you stay stagnant, then eventually what happens is you die because someone leapfrogs you. And one of the best things to do or one of the best uses of story is trying to communicate internally what you're doing at the company. And so the more that you can, so it starts internally, and then externally sometimes it's easier, sometimes it's harder, but the more that you can externally communicate what you are trying to do and why you're trying to do it, and really emphasize why you're trying to do it, like the type of audience that you're trying to help, doing that through story is what ultimately resonates with your audience. I don't know if I answered your question or not.
Yeah. So how do you pull out those stories? Like for a personal story, like let's say your chicken nugget story, right?
Yeah.
But you can't use chicken nugget stories on your website.
Oh, totally. Yeah.
So how do you pull them out to get people engaged?
Yeah, so one of the best ways of doing that is a third person story that does not involve you. So, and it doesn't have to involve anyone you know. It just means that there's someone out there who needs help with something, right? So there's a CEO at some company who needs help with how much money his company is spending on the cloud. So you paint a picture of that CEO at some company you paint a picture of the CEO of some company whose company is spending way too much money on the cloud, and he or she is trying to find out a solution. And then you walk through how then you tell the story of how your company is going to help that fictitious CEO. And what that does for the audience, or specifically for any CEO in the audience, is they see that fictitious CEO, and subconsciously what that's doing for them is it's saying, okay, that's me on stage. And that's really what's happening with, at least with good advertising, that's what's usually happening. And that's what's happening with good storytelling.
So when you use testimonials, when you give case studies, that's the same type of thing, is you're showing people the rise of somebody else and how you probably can help them.
Totally. Yeah. So here's an example. That cloud one that I was just relaying is not totally unique to my life. So I helped a company. This is outside of Duarte, but I helped a company named Cloudability. And this was, I don't know, 3 years ago or so. And they were just getting started. So they didn't even have their Series A funding yet, right? And the story that we were telling was of companies that didn't know how to turn the cloud off or just didn't really have someone monitoring it. So in their investor pitch, they used the case study. So a lot of times case study and story can be used interchangeably. But they used the case study of a company that they had helped who had bought all these servers for the weekend and then forgot to turn them off and then suddenly had blown $5,000 for no reason just because no one had turned it off. Mm. As audience members, you then hear that and say, oh, we need to either turn this off, or what would be a heck of a lot easier than having to remember that in the stresses of our day when we have a big fire that creeps up on Friday, would be easier is if there was just a program that reminded us. And as an audience member, you hear that case study, and it's a lot easier for you to then say, oh, now that makes sense. Because the alternative is a bunch of adjectives and big corporate words that may or may not really be concrete enough for people to understand.
They can't envision it because it's too far out there.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of abstract words that a story, whether it's a story of chicken nuggets or a corporate story, that sticks with people a lot better than abstract words do.
So, and it's interesting because telling a story to an audience is important, but also telling the story through written word and getting that to strike the right chord where it's friendly but not too friendly, where it feels like your buddy. It's finding that middle ground. How do you find that sweet spot?
Well, I would actually say you want to err on the side of talking to your buddy.
Okay.
For sure. Now, I mean, there's talking to your buddy where you're cursing and, like punching him on the shoulder, and that's obviously not what you want to do. But you want to err on the side of speaking to people like they're your friend. So
okay, go ahead.
Yeah, so there are obviously exceptions to this, but in general, speaking conversationally works better than speaking in big business terms. So I know most people, when they hear that, because I deal with this all the time, right? And most people are like, well, no, you don't work where I do, man. The expectation is that you're going to say, you have to use these big business terms because that's how you establish credibility. I mean, that's what everybody says. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure there are companies out there where that's true. Yeah. But most of the time, that is resistance that is coming just because you're being asked to do something that's not what you usually do. If you look at, I'm going to use Apple as an example, which makes me gag a little because everybody does that. But the fact of the matter is everybody gets this. Steve Jobs spoke conversationally. Mm-hmm. He talked, 2007 iPhone launch, he talked about how the BlackBerry was the cool phone at the time, right? And had all these plastic buttons on it. And he didn't dress that up in big words. Well, it makes it unusable, blah, blah, blah. He just said, you have all these plastic buttons here. You don't need plastic buttons on every site that you go to.
Yeah.
Err on the side of speaking conversational.
And it takes practice, right? You're not going to get it right the first time. It's going to take a couple passes, service page, sales page, website, video, whatever.
Yeah.
But the more you do it, the more it feels comfortable to you.
Absolutely. And I think, really, if you look at the way, one of the things in my observation on the internet has really, really opened up is people speaking to their readers like they're real people. So I know that you still have some print media still speaks very, I have typed up a paper and someone out there is reading it. But popular blogs, videos, people talk to their audience like they're friends. So that means making jokes. Mm-hmm. That means making observations, trying to be funny. That's okay a lot of the time.
Yeah. And in fact, goes back to that, make them laugh a little bit. Now pay attention to me. Yeah. Yeah. some of my favorite bloggers, yeah, they're not typical, but they're the type of people I buy from because I feel comfortable with them.
Right.
Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And not that I think I'm the greatest teacher in the world, but like I still teach at one class. I kid you not, I put maybe 15 minutes of prep work in every day. This is a 3-day class, so that's 45 minutes prep work total. Now, I've got all this stuff there, so that's slightly misleading, right? Because I teach it every term. But I just don't use PowerPoint, and I tell stories of people, how people have found jobs in the past. And I mean, these kids walk out of the classroom like, oh, that was the best class I've ever taken. And it's like, I don't think I'm that good at it. It's just like I'm speaking to them conversationally, and I'm giving them things they can remember. And that's a lot of the battle.
Yeah. Yeah, because, you have a bullet, you'd have 10 points, and you're like, where do I start? But if you're like, if you tell a story about how Sam found a job by reaching out to Nike or reaching out to Duarte like you, like, boom, all of a sudden they're like, I could do that. Yeah.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. And that's what goes back to, you want, I could do that too, or I could be that, wherever that is in that stage of that story. Because then you're like, okay, well, I want to hire this person because I want to be that. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. That's interesting, though, because it's like, even myself, I know that, and I know that it's very important, but it's still like you, and, as a copywriter, benefits are so important, but how do you weave in that story to make sure that they see those benefits, not just, hey, here's the benefit of working with me. It's, here's the story behind it as well.
Yeah. Well, that's really easy. Well, hold on. It's not really easy. It's really easy for me to give you an answer, and then implementing it, I realize it's a little bit harder. But every single story is the same thing, which is you've got your hero. So the hero is that CEO in the cloud or whomever it is out there who has this problem, and here's how my solution fixed that problem. Mm-hmm. So here they were, and they had this problem. They reached this conflict, and thankfully, there was this beautiful product out there in the world that helped them fix that. That's true if it's copywriting, presentation, podcasts, whatever.
Yeah, yeah. So what is one change you've made, maybe since you started at Duarte, and how you tell a story? Do you tell lots of little stories? Do you tell larger stories that kind of weave in and out? Or give us a little tidbit there.
Yeah, I used to gravitate towards those chicken nugget stories because they were funny. Mm-hmm. And I think I find a lot of my comfort in funny. Then I realized that those, like, if you have a long presentation in the business world, you can tell a story like that, but sometimes people are sitting there like, hey, I've got a lot to do. What does this have to do with anything? Mm-hmm. The biggest change that I have made in telling stories, however, is simply having fun myself telling them. And that might sound kind of contradictory to what I said, because the audience is the hero, the audience is the Luke Skywalker character, right? Here's the deal. If I'm not having fun as the one who is presenting, the one who is applying story to his presentation, there's no way that the audience will. Yeah. So I'm being selfish, like as backwards as this sounds, I'm being selfish if I'm not having fun, because that's making it really bad for my audience who has 1,000 other things to do. When I first started at Duarte, so I've got this 8-hour workshop that I do, right? And when I first started there, I was so nervous about getting every single word right. Because they give us this script, and you don't have to follow the script strictly, but there are ideas for each slide, really long slide deck. And I was so nervous about, like, I've got to get this word perfect. I've got to know the script exactly. And my God, I was a nervous wreck. The first time I ever did this workshop, I slept 2 hours. 2 hours the night before, and I had to talk for 8 straight hours the next day. And I would sleep like a baby. One of the reasons why is just because I've done it more, so I know it better. But the bigger reason why is because I have fun with it. And I don't stress about whether I've worded things perfectly and whether I've nailed every last detail. if what I say doesn't make sense, I'm gonna hope that the audience is gonna ask me a question and say, wait, that doesn't make sense. So the thing that's changed the most for me is just that I have fun with what I do, and when I'm telling the story, I have fun. The story still needs to make sense. If it doesn't make sense, my hope, and this hasn't happened yet, but my hope is that someone in the audience is going to say, wait. What you're saying doesn't make any sense at all.
Yeah. Oh, and then it's asking for that feedback. Be willing to be like, hey, like if you have any questions, if you're lost or curious, let me know.
Yeah. Right.
And giving them permission, because sometimes people, when you're up on stage, you're like, they don't want to interrupt, or so. But if you talking conversationally too, I bet it's a lot easier to interrupt you versus a highfalutin presentation. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. And I should qualify that they very much know from the beginning that they can interrupt me.
Yeah.
So I realize there are going to be some circumstances where that's not the ideal presenter-audience interaction.
You make a great point. I'm actually reading a book called Play. I don't know if you've ever...
Oh, man. That's on my reading list. It sounds really awesome.
It's really good. And basically, like, the whole concept is everybody needs to play, and it needs to be integrated into work. It needs to be integrated into your life because you're going to learn better. You're going to give better talks. You're going to do better accounting, whatever it is, because you're having fun with it. And just like you said, like, I have fun with my talks, and the audience can feel that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, this has been so great. Thank you so much. This is
fantastic. It's my pleasure.
The time flew by. I can't believe it. So where can they?
Because I talked a lot.
Where can they learn more about you?
Yeah, so you can Duarte.com. That's who I work for. My Twitter is mpac. So by the way, great job pronouncing my first name, or my last name rather. The Mike is the easy part. Pacchione a little harder. I've had Pacchione is the most common one, but we also get we used to get telemarketers calling my house when I grew up, and people would be like, "Oh, can I speak to Mr. Pacino?" And I'm like, those letters are not even in my name. How are you saying this? Anyway, so the last name is pronounced Pacchione or Pacchione if you want to sound impressive Italian. But my Twitter is the easier spelling, which is at mpac, so MPACC.
Okay, perfect.
And those would be the best places in the world to find me in my magic world. Yeah.
Thanks again. This is fantastic.
Hey, my pleasure, Carl. Keep up the good work, my man.
Thanks.